Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Jonis from Western University. I actually met Mark at the LOVE conference, the Lake Ontario Visionary Experience Conference in Niagara Falls last year. We had a great conversation over dinner, over his research program, and I thought it would just be amazing to have him at our symposium. Jennifer McKay gave a great talk about doing research directly in the classroom, informing her class. So there's very practical take-home messages. Mark's research goes really deep into the cognitive mechanisms and how the brain actually functions during reading. And at our recent EdCog reading group, we read one of his papers, and we were fascinated to learn even about dyslexia, that most people in the room assumed it was a visual deficit, and then learning that it's a phonological challenge kind of just changes even the types of interventions that we think might work in addressing dyslexia. So a bit of background about Mark. He's a professor and faculty scholar at the University of Western Ontario, where he's a member of the Department of Psychology at Western's Brain and Mind Institute. He received his PhD from the University of Southern Carolina.
No,
and California, sorry.
Wrong coast.
His research examines the cognitive and brain bases of language and reading. His work spans a range of population techniques, but focuses on the study of developmental dyslexia in children, using both behavioral and neuroimaging techniques. He serves on the editorial board at the Canadian Journal of Experimental Psychology, and he's previously served as an associate editor of the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing. And his research has been funded by NSERC, CIHR, and by the National Institutes of Health in the USA. And as far as I know, he is not a contributor to the Clever Behaviorist model. Or are you?
The which?
That's okay. Please join me in welcoming Mark Jonis.
Thank you. Can people hear me? I've sort of lost my voice on the drive down here, but so hi, thank you for inviting me. This is great. So what I'm going to talk about today has to do with reading ability and looking at the neural bases of reading ability and the sorts of work that my lab has done and other labs around the world on really the very basic science of how reading works and also how reading fails to work. So where I usually start these talks is to talk about the idea of reading ability, which is something that we take for granted, and we think about it as sort of equivalent to spoken language, and even though it really isn't. That is, that our knowledge of spoken language was something that we acquired fairly early in life in a way that was probably incidental and very deliberate rather than being imposed on us as something that we're taught, right? So nobody takes a baby and sits the baby down in the chair and shows them a ball and says, this is a ball. And if you do, it's great and it's great fun, but it's not really going to amount to a hill of beans in terms of what a child learns. On the other hand, when we teach somebody to read, it happens later in life. It takes many, many years for that child to gain real proficiency where they're learning from a text, where they're really doing anything other than reading fairly simple texts or fairly simple individual words. And I think it boils down to the idea that humans didn't really evolve to read, that reading instead is a sort of evolutionary kludge where we have these sorts of physiological, we might call it evolutionary changes to what it is to be human that has allowed us to learn spoken language. But reading is actually a fairly new innovation. It only popped up maybe 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, depending on what you call written language. And before that, people were still speaking, right? Whereas reading is something that's been imposed on top of it. So the reason why reading is hard is that it builds on other cognitive abilities that kind of need to be there in the first place before a child can learn to read. And it's sort of shoehorned in there in a funny way so that we can actually see changes in the brain as a result of somebody learning to read versus somebody who's not learned to read, because it's not the natural state of affairs. So if you take a word like professor, perfectly good word, you can think about how we read as you see the visual form of professor, right? We've got those letters and that kind of comes into our retina and some magic happens, and then the concept of what a professor is pops into our head, right? It's not some old guy with a lab coat anymore. It's like normal people, right? Yeah. So the other thing though is when you're reading, there's actually two things going on. As an adult, we think, well, what happens is you've seen this word 1,000 times before, and you know what it looks like, and that you're mapping it as a kind of wholesale process onto a mental image of, you know, what a professor is and your encyclopedic semantic knowledge of what that is. There's also something else going on, though, which is this concept of decoding, that you're taking those individual letters and mapping those individual letters onto what you might call a phonological code, right? The auditory, articulatory representations that we maintain for what the sound of that word is. And that, in fact, both of those things are happening in parallel. Or you can think about it as they're kind of two different pathways, right? That there's a visual pathway that goes directly to the semantics of the word, and there's also this what you might call indirect or decoding pathway, where what you know about the letter P and the letter R and the F and so on and the vowels allows you to break it down phoneme by phoneme or letter by letter to get the sound of the word. So there's this concept of reading by sound, and that might be thought of as an indirect pathway to getting to the semantics of the word. Certainly the goal of reading is to understand it. It's not to just know what the sounds are, right? It's to actually understand what that word is and ultimately what the text is. There's a direct way to do that and an indirect way to do that. You might call that this whole word processing, where you're recognizing it holistically, versus what I would call decoding. So whole word is the idea that we recognize words holistically as entire chunks of information that are familiar to us, versus what you might call mapping letters onto sounds, decoding, right? So you take the individual letters and you map those onto the phonemes. So for instance, in the word shoot, you know that shoot has the sh sound, and my IPA alphabet's gotten messed up here, and the oo sound and the t sound, and you, by breaking it down into those individual letters and mapping those onto individual phonemes and bringing it all back together, you get the word shoot, which you can then use to access the semantic representation. This process of decoding is sometimes called decomposition or phonics or the sublexical route, depending on which literature you're delving into, but they're all the same thing. It's the idea that phonology, the sounds of speech, is important to how we read, right? It's not just a visual code, it's a mapping between a visual code and its phonological representations. Super important stuff. As I said before, what makes reading so interesting is it's not one single thing. There's no single one brain region that's going to be engaged in reading for the reasons that I just told you, that we're actually doing a whole bunch of different things. It's a bit of a juggling act to get that visual code into a semantic code, and it tends to engage, I'm showing you just the left hemisphere, but I promise it's also happening in the right hemisphere as well, a whole bunch of regions that we know are engaged in this linguistic processing. Regardless of whether I'm telling people, for instance, to read and think about the sound of a word or read and think about the meaning of the word, and I'll explain how you do that a little later, you can see that a whole bunch of brain regions light up. So there's this guy named Stanislas Dehaene who does a lot of very good reading research in France and really around the world now, where he's established, him and many others, has established this idea of a reading network, that we can break down what parts of the brain are actually being engaged during reading. So for instance, when you are reading, here's our brain, that reading is a visual act first and foremost, and it comes into these visual cortices in the occipital lobe. But that we also know that there are regions in the occipitotemporal junction that are actually being used to recognize specifically word-specific information. So over here in the occipital cortex, that lights up for everything, right? That region is being engaged for any kind of visual information. But that we get a special type of engagement in this more anterior region. Some people have called it inferior temporal, other people call it visual word form area. It kind of depends on what you think the function of that region is, but it seems to respond specifically to whole words. It seems to care about letters being assembled into legal strings of visual information. So it's still a very visual part of the brain that seems to be agnostic about the meaning or the sound of the word. And that then we have connections onwards onto regions that are important for accessing meaning. And there are quite a few of them in both the frontal lobe, along the anterior and posterior temporal lobe, as you move more superior also into posterior parietal regions. And that those themselves interact with other parts of the brain that seem to care about the sound of a word. So for instance, most famously, the superior temporal gyrus, which is where auditory cortex is. So that's regions where actually, those are the kinds of regions that initially light up when you hear stuff. Not necessarily when you read stuff. It turns out that it also lights up when you read stuff. So as you read, you're also engaging both semantic and auditory regions, or phonological regions. So there's a whole host of these regions also in the frontal lobe and in the parietal lobe. all of these are linked together, and that's what these gray arrows depict, and there's certainly more of these gray arrows than I have room to depict here, but it's simply the idea that there's a whole host of brain regions, they're organized into networks, and those networks themselves connect to each other to give rise to this thing called reading. There's no single part of the brain that's doing reading. Rather, it's you might call it like an orchestra, right? Where there might be a conductor, but ultimately the music only happens when everything works together. Everything starts communicating to give rise to this beautiful thing called reading. The problem with that reading network view is that it turns out that it's the sum of many different studies. No single study shows us the reading network because there's so much going on, because there's so much to reading. In a typical study of reading, especially having to do with neuroimaging, you might show somebody a single word or a pair of words, or you might have them think about words, or you might have them read a text, or you might have them rapidly name one word after another. But you know, the entire act of reading an entire connected text, the way that you would actually sit down, for instance, with your morning paper and actually read the paper, you know, it's hard to do that in an MRI scanner or, for instance, an event-related potentials kind of study. So when we're getting at this, we've triangulated towards this reading network view across many different studies and, of course, across many different populations of subjects. One of the concerns is that when you do a neuroimaging study in particular, what you're looking at is what you might call normal adults. And I've taken great pains to put normal adults in scare quotes there because, you know, who are they? Well, they turn out to be grad students and undergrads. Well, how normal are your undergrads and grad students? You know, I say this facetiously, except let's face it, what do grad students and undergrads do all day long? They read, right? If you look at exposure to reading, this is like the 99th percentile. It's, you know, regardless of whether we're talking about a sample of Western society or a sample of the world society. The kind of reading that happens is huge when you're, you know, a 21-year-old first-year master's student who wants to make 40 bucks by lying in an MRI scanner for 45 minutes. So we're talking about probably a non-representative sample. And so there is some concern about that. And the other piece of the puzzle here is how much variability is normal, right? Does everybody look like that average brain? Because in these MRI studies, as I'll show you in a bit, what you're doing is you run a lot of subjects and then you group them all together. It's like any other psychology experiment. But how much does any one person look like the average? That's actually much more difficult to tell because there's a lot of noise in the system. You know, there's a lot of averaging that happens both within subject and between subject to get to these beautiful brain pictures that, you know, they like to put in magazines and stuff. So part one of my talk today looks at these individual differences and looks at them in particular with adults. And this is with my colleague Suzanne Welcome, who's now at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She was a postdoc in my lab a few years ago and ran these studies. What we were interested in this study was trying to find a way forward from this network view of how reading works as a static thing to a more dynamic thing where, in fact, the way that this network lights up might vary considerably depending on what kind of reading you're doing, and also varying between subjects as well. From one individual to the next, you might see considerable differences in what this network looks like because people are different, both in their absolute reading ability and experience, and also in their reading ability having to do with what we call these reading sub-processes. Some people are more inclined to read for sound. Some people are more inclined to read for meaning. And this difference here is certainly not an absolute, right? You can't put two people in two different bins, but rather that there may be some interesting graded differences on these two dimensions. And that, in fact, the dimensions may be more orthogonal than we think. It might not be that some people are more sound readers and some people are more visual readers, but in fact that these are two different subnetworks of the reading network that are getting more or less boosted in one individual versus another. A way that we look at this is to take these behavioral differences and correlate them with brain measures. So we actually measure brain activity in two different ways. One is using a functional MRI, which is a measure of cortical activation, how much any given portion of the neural cortex is being engaged at any given moment, as measured using an MRI scanner. The other is white matter connectivity, which is a static image. It doesn't care about what the subject is doing at that point in time. They're simply lying still. We'll put on a movie or put on Netflix or music, and they just lie still for a few minutes, and we take a static image of their brain that looks at white matter, and in particular, not just how much white matter is there, but how coherent it is. And I'll explain that in a moment. MRI versus fMRI, well, people know what an MRI scanner is. We use the magic of powerful magnets to look at to quantify water molecules in the body. So more water means that we get a brighter image in that particular pixel of a three-dimensional image. And functional MRI is one step further. It's the difference between a static photo and a movie, where a movie is actually just a sequence of one photo after another. So we take image after image after image of MRI data from a brain, but the MRI is actually tuned, in this case, not to water molecules, but to the difference between oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin. And that difference between oxy and deoxyhemoglobin shows us how much oxygen is being taken up by the cells in the brain as information is being processed. So the rise and fall of this oxygenated blood gives us information about exactly how much processing is occurring exactly where in the brain. So we can actually identify not just what the brain looks like, but actually what the brain is doing over time to give us an idea of what function is. It's still an indirect measure of function, but one that we think is still fairly valid. In our study, we recruited 20 subjects, and we recruited them from the community at large, not just from around campus. We had flyers up in various community centers and so on all around the city of London. And our attempt here was to get a representative sample of what the population actually looks like, both in terms of age and in terms of, for instance, years of education. So we have people, the average is 30, but the range is actually quite big. Again, the years of education here, we've got an average of 15 years, so lots of people with advanced degrees, but also people with just high school versus people with PhDs. So a pretty good representative sample. The other piece of the puzzle, though, was we looked at these different measures of, for instance, nonverbal IQ, where the average here should be 100, and we're right about 100, and we get a very big range between fairly low at 72 to fairly high at 140. So it's just one test, but it's a nonverbal test, and we're focusing here on other tests that are highly verbal, so we thought a nonverbal would balance that out, at least to a certain extent. We have the two reading measures, one of reading familiar words, and another reading non-words. And there again, we get about what you would expect in the population. Just shy of 100 would be the average. 100 would be the average. But again, a fairly significant range. And also reading comprehension. So not just reading individual words or reading nonsense words, but also comprehending connected text using this Nelson-Denny test that gives us both a comprehension and a rate measure. And again, fairly significant variability in terms of what people could actually understand from the text that they're reading. Then we put them in the MRI scanner, and we give them 3 different tasks in the MRI scanner in order to activate their brain in different ways, all related to reading. On every trial, while they were in the scanner, they saw 2 different words, and the words varied one trial after another, but the idea was that they were being asked to make one of 3 judgments. They would judge either the visual form of the word, so is the lower and uppercase pattern that they're seeing the same or different across those 2 words. The idea there was they were simply focusing on visual information and not focusing on either the meaning or the sound of the word. So that gives us a nice baseline of what happens incidentally as you see these words, without asking them to do anything explicit about it. Then we would ask them explicitly on a different set of trials, but with the same words, do these 2 words rhyme? And then on another set of trials, we'd ask them, is one of these the name of an animal, which is a semantic test. It's a test of what is the meaning of these words. By getting them to do different blocks of all 3 of these different trial types, what we get is a picture of how different types of cognitive processing is being engaged as people read words. There's a lot of data in this paper. I'm just going to show you a few images here. One is to look at what happens when people are reading for sound versus visual processing. So if you take away what happens just when they're making a visual judgment versus when they're reading for sound, that's what we've colored in here. And we get both these temporal regions and lots of frontal regions as well that seem to be engaged by reading for sound. So it looks like the reading network, although we do notice that a lot of semantic and visual regions seem to be absent from this pattern. If you look at reading for meaning, we get some of the same regions, but also some additional readings. So if you look at reading for meaning versus both the phonological and the visual tasks together, that gives us the clearest picture. You see lots of engagement of a more anterior portion of the frontal lobe, some posterior and anterior temporal lobe in the left hemisphere, also some parietal lobe, especially this angular gyrus region, and then also some right hemisphere regions as well that seem to be engaged by semantic processing. Not at all unexpected, but simply illustrating that from one individual to the next, you see all kinds of variability overall, depending on the task. The more interesting thing here is looking at each individual and saying, well, in these regions that tend to light up, how does the activation of these regions vary? And does this correlate with anything interesting? So what we do is we take every voxel in the brain, basically every three-dimensional pixel, and throw that into a regression where we take the activation of that pixel on that subject and correlate that with all these different behavioral measures that we collected outside the scanner. Apply a whole bunch of statistical corrections, because that's a whole lot of t-tests that we're doing. And what we get is certain brain regions that correlate uniquely with different kinds of cognitive processes. So for instance, if we take the non-word reading task, this is a task where they see only non-words. So they have to read for sound. They've never seen these words before. They have no meaning. We correlate that with fMRI signal. We get a region here in superior temporal gyrus that seems to correlate very highly with the amount to which people are activating this brain region during these reading tasks. So this region here seems to show that difference. A different part of the brain shows a modulation for reading for meaning. So if we're looking at reading for meaning, it's in fact an inverse relationship. And that's an interesting one, because the region here is actually auditory cortex. People who are less adept at, how do I put this? People who tend to activate this region more actually don't tend to be as good at reading for meaning. There's a trading relationship here where people show higher comprehension rates when they are activating this region less compared to when they activate this region more. So there's a trade-off here in these different parts of the brain that seem to map onto the individual differences within subject. Now, the other thing else I'll point out, those are just two different regions that showed this. Using various analyses, the article shows a lot of other regions that respect this. That's just a couple of the kinds of things that we found by looking at this using this approach. The other piece here is the same individuals also participated in a DTI scan. So DTI scanning, as I said, you simply lie still and we take white matter images of your brain. And what happens is that the water in your brain diffuses in certain directions more readily than in other directions because of the properties of myelin, which make up white matter. And so the more myelinated a part of the brain is, the more the diffusion properties tend to be what we call anisotropic. We get diffusion where water moves readily in one direction but not in another direction. And using various mathematical tricks, then we can come up with an image of all the fibers in your brain, all of those white matter bundles that traverse all the different parts of your brain. And here it's colored in depending on the direction in which those fibers run, and then identify different tracts. So we get these very pretty pictures, and then the question is, well, what can you do with this? One thing you can do with this is identify different streamlines of white matter, that is, white matter tracts that seem to correlate more versus less with these different behavioral measures. So we have the behavioral measures, we also have these white matter measures, and there again, there's a lot of data here, and I'm only going to show you a couple of things, but what's interesting, for instance, is that if you look at left auditory cortex, which is over here, and then look at all the white matter projections that project out of that. You can, as a group, see that these projections run both, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, and then also across the two hemispheres from left to right. There's a lot of white matter connecting auditory cortex with a whole lot of other parts of the brain. That's nothing new. What's interesting is that the coherence of those white matter projections seems to matter a lot for reading. When we can actually correlate the size of those projections with people's phonemic decoding, that is, with their non-word reading scores, what we find is a very clear positive correlation between those two measures. What seems to be going on here is that individuals who are better decoders tend to be not just using that superior temporal gyrus region more, but they also tend to be having more coherent connections from that region to other parts of the brain, both in the right hemisphere and in the left hemisphere. And using different analytic tools in this article, we measured the kinds of white matter tracts that seem to matter. The other thing here is that if you look at other kinds of behavioral measures like IQ or text comprehension instead of non-word reading, you find that other parts of the brain show this kind of effect rather than just this part. So it's not just that there's one white matter region that matters for all of reading. Instead, it's that different kinds of white matter connections are going to be important for different kinds of reading skill and other kinds of cognitive skill as well, and that we can actually predict reading ability, not to a super high degree, but to a certain extent. Our values in the 0.4 range with those behavioral measures. So overall, then, we do have this reading network in the brain, right? We've not disproven the existence of a reading network in the brain by any stretch of the imagination. However, what we're seeing is that there's actually tremendous variation in this reading network. That what we see when people say, well, the reading network consists of these 4 regions, or something like that, that in fact that varies a lot study by study based on the tasks that people are being asked to do. And we show that even within our own study, that depending on how we define reading as either a decoding task or a comprehension task, you see different parts of the brain actually come more or less online. The other thing, though, is that even within individuals, some individuals are going to be better decoders, some individuals are going to be better comprehenders, some people are better on everything, and that those kinds of normal variations also have consequences with respect to how their brain is wired up. It's not that there's just one single reading center that seems to be modulated, rather it's a lot of different reading centers that are being modulated. The next part of the talk focuses on what happens in the case of children who have problems learning to read. So when we talk about normal variability, then there's also this idea that at the very bottom end of that normal variability are kids with a frank reading deficit who are failing to learn to read in an adequate fashion. These are kids with what you might call developmental dyslexia or developmental reading disability, where the general definition here is that it's a deficit in reading that's not caused by a more fundamental impairment. So for instance, these kids show slow and laborious reading. Individual words are read very slowly with great effort. And also that they tend to produce many errors as they're actually reading these individual words, and yet their cognitive achievement seems relatively good. Either by definition, sometimes as an exclusionary measure, these kids are described as having normal IQs. Now, that doesn't mean kids with low IQs don't also have reading problems potentially, but this is how often developmental dyslexia is being defined. So the idea is that the reading deficit can't be explained through other means, as a sensory problem, as an environmental problem. It tends to be something more endogenous. One thing that I'll point out here that I point out in all the talks that I give about dyslexia is that it has nothing to do with a visual problem. It's not about reversing letters or seeing words upside down. So for instance, like all good scientists who have kids, I'll use my own kid as the example. So my daughter's name is Marianne, and here she is writing her name backwards in chalk across the driveway. So what's interesting about this, in fact, is that that's perfectly normal and kids do it all the time. And in fact, the kids will go back and forth. So just a few days later, this came back from school and she'd signed her name Marianne in the correct direction in this case. So reading backwards doesn't seem to have a lot to do with dyslexia. It does have a lot to do with normal reading development. Kids forget whether P and Q, which way the tail goes on the P and the Q all the time. And it's not a good indicator of a reading deficit. What seems to cause dyslexia is that children have difficulty with phonology. They have problems not just with the written form of language, but also with the spoken form of language. And so this is typically measured using what we call phonological awareness tests, where children are being asked explicitly to reflect on their knowledge of the phonological sounds of words. So for instance, they'll be asked to say split without p. We can ask them about rhyming. Is candle and sandal, do those two words rhyme? And so these are phonological awareness measures where they seem to rely minimally on the written code, and yet this seems to have consequences for how kids learn that written code. The reason why phonology matters is that kids have difficulty mapping spelling onto sound if their internal representation of the sound is not adequate to begin with, or if they have difficulty retrieving that internal representation of the sound of words. So for instance, learning that the first sound in ball is B, is the letter B, hinges first on knowing that ball starts with the sound B. So being able to break the word ball into its constituent phonemes, we take that for granted as skilled readers, but in fact, pre-readers who are very good at that already tend to go on to become better readers later on, compared to kids who find it difficult to tell you that the first sound in ball is B. One possibility is that those kids tend to compensate via a direct route, right? That when they do learn to read, they're more likely to rely on recognizing the words as undecomposed wholes. So when they read professor, they just know that's the word professor, rather than using these phoneme to sound these letter to sound correspondences in order to read more efficiently. In an fMRI study of children with dyslexia, these were kids between the age, I believe, of 9 to 13, yeah. And what we looked at was brain activity while these kids performed a spoken language task. So what we were interested in this particular experiment was the idea that it shouldn't just be reading, right? Don't just give kids reading tests and then be surprised that their MRIs come back different because they're reading words in the MRI scanner. When you're worse at something, obviously that's coming from your brain and something's going to be different about where it is in your brain. But here we're interested in the idea that if there really is something about phonology in these kids, then giving them any task that taps their phonological system should do this. So they see a word while they're in the scanner, they see a picture in the scanner and then they hear a word. They're being asked to match the picture to the word. And they do this repeatedly over the course of several runs within a session, and we get regions lighting up. And what we see, for instance, is that typical readers versus kids with dyslexia in the right hemisphere, typical readers tend to under-engage their right hemisphere while they do this task, compared to their left hemisphere not shown, where it's the normal reading regions, the normal spoken language regions are lighting up in their temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. Kids with dyslexia, on the other hand, show a whole lot of right hemisphere activation that you don't see in these control kids. So something's going on in these kids, and you can actually look at the subtraction of the two if you wish, and you see actually that they underutilize some of these right frontal regions and overutilize some of these right temporal regions as they're processing spoken language. Again, there was no written stuff in this task. So this is an interesting result because it suggests that there's something about the way that a child with dyslexia is wiring up their spoken language system even before they start learning to read. Another way to look at this is using something called event-related potentials, and that's where I'll wrap up today. Event-related potentials is another way of measuring brain activity where it's more time-sensitive but perhaps less spatially sensitive. So the beauty of fMRI is that you can really pinpoint exactly where in the brain a certain thing is happening. The drawback is it's kind of expensive. If you move around too much, it leads to blurry images that you can't really interpret. It doesn't tend to be kid-friendly, whereas this thing called event-related potentials consists of an electrode net here that we put on children's heads. So this is an electrode array that's actually embedded in a type of cloth cap that looks like a swimming cap. Each one of these leads here is simply a passive electrode that's measuring electrical potentials on the scalp. Over the course of a 45-minute to 1 hour session, you can acquire scads of data about what sorts of electrical potentials are happening on the scalp, where the source of those electrical potentials are cortical regions that are firing synchronously. The relative amplitude of the waveforms that we see give us insights about the kinds of cognitive processing that occurs when kids are doing different tasks. In our lab, we're interested in this idea of spoken word recognition as a correlate of reading, as a surrogate of difficulties with reading, where our interest in particular is the idea that when, for instance, I say the word cone here, that the person I'm speaking to has got sort of a mental dictionary or lexicon or some sort of memory system where they're trying to retrieve that word from their memory system, right? So you hear cone and you're activating cone, right? You're choosing that word. But it turns out that you're also activating other words. And there's various ways that you can get at this to show that people actually, when they hear cone, they actually think phone, bone, comb, coat, coal, and so on. For instance, using, passive priming, we can see that it's actually easier to retrieve these competitors when you've just heard this word cone. In the ERP test that we use, it's a little bit simpler. You simply see a picture of an object. And one thing that we notice is that when you see a picture of a common object, it tends to prime that word in your head. You tend to think about the sound of the word. So even without seeing the word cone, if you see a picture of cone, already the word cone pops up in your head. Then a few moments later, the child sees either the matching word and says, yes, that matches, or they hear the word bone instead, which rhymes, but is not the correct word. Or they hear the word comb, again, not the correct word, but sounds like it, right? Cone, comb, it's just the last phoneme that's different. And then fox, which would be the unrelated baseline. That would be a complete mismatch. By the way, this is work by Amy DeRoche, who's now at University of Winnipeg. She was a grad student in my lab and did a lot of this work while she was there. What we find when we do this is that, well, first of all, you record EEGs continuously as the children see these pictures and hear these words. Then you average trials where you do more than one of each of these trials, right? We'll do 30 or 40 of them and average them together, and what we get is a waveform. So we plot that waveform here, and this is called an event-related potential waveform. For various weird reasons, we plot negative upwards. It doesn't really matter because negative and positive are really just relative terms here, right? It has nothing to do with activation or inhibition. It has to do just with the changes in the electrical potentials on the scalp as a result of neurons firing. So what we see is that we get this ERP waveform in response to, for instance, seeing cone and then hearing the word comb. Or sorry, seeing cone and hearing the word cone versus a mismatched trial, right? Versus a trial where you expect to hear cone, but instead you hear fox. Actually, the waveform, starting at about 300 milliseconds, really starts to be different. It goes upwards in this negative going direction, giving us what's called an N400 mismatch effect, where the thing you expected versus the thing you actually got are different from each other. There's a difference in the voltage on the scalp in certain electrodes when that happens. Gives us this idea that even before the child presses the button, no, that's not the right word, their brain has already detected, whoops, that's not the right word. So what can you do with this? Well, these N400 effects may turn out to be good indices of what we call lexical competition, how well people are detecting the correct word, choosing the correct word when they're expecting a different word. Are they different in dyslexia? Well, maybe there's less competition, right? Maybe they're not showing as much competition between words because they don't realize, for instance, that cone and comb are phonologically similar. Or maybe it's more competition, where they tend to have they're more likely to think about cone and comb as the same word. So there's two hypotheses that give different predictions about what you're going to see in this N400 study. The other thing is that different kinds of phonological stimuli may give us different effects because these are not all the same, right? Cone fox are completely unrelated. Are they going to confuse cone and fox? Do they care? Versus cone comb or cone bone. Cone bone is interesting because they rhyme with each other. If you give them cone fox, what you see, this is the control kids here, what you see is you get this N400 effect where when you get the unrelated sound compared to the picture, you see this very clear difference between those two. And it's exactly what we expect. When we look at kids with dyslexia, you get actually very similar effects, that the shape of the waveforms are slightly different, but really the magnitude of the effects over time are about the same. So when they hear fox, their brains are pretty much as rapid and efficient at knowing that fox is not the word that they're expecting. So that's interesting because it suggests that when there's big phonological differences, their brains are pretty tuned into what's going on. But let's look at a smaller phonological difference now. If we look at rhyming, what you see with rhyming is that if you compare the mismatch effect for fox with the mismatch effect for bone. So bone is interesting because bone and cone sound the same. They're not the same word. And kids are very close to 100% at saying bone and cone are not the same word. But we see actually a difference in the ERP where it's actually an attenuation in the effect that seems to suggest that we've actually primed the word that rhymes with the word that you're expecting. That you get this priming effect where it's actually easier to retrieve the word bone as a result of having just heard cone. This phonological priming effect is very interesting. It's robust in both kids and adults. It's even robust across languages. It's also robust that kids with dyslexia don't show this phonological priming effect. We've shown it now both with ERP in both English and in Chinese, and we've also shown it with different tasks that look at this in a different way. They don't seem to be as aware early on in processing that those two words rhyme with each other. They're treating them the same. So in their minds, bone and cone are as different from each other as fox and cone. The reason why seems to be that they're not organizing their mental dictionary phonologically using these rhyme relationships. And it turns out that these rhyming relationships are extremely important for learning to read. Now, if you ask a child with dyslexia who's 10, 12 years old, do bone and cone rhyme with each other, they'll tell you, yes, they do. That behaviorally, these kids are actually very good at it. And I've plotted that out here. This is the behavioral test that we gave them as they're doing the ERP study. So this is the same study. This is the behavior overt judgments. Their overt judgments are not distinguishable from those of controls. Okay? They tend to be a little slower in making the judgment, but their accuracy is just as good. So one of the advantages of these neuroimaging approaches is actually you can look at processes that are uncontaminated by behavioral effects or that are undetectable behaviorally. That at some point kids actually become quite good at phonological awareness even though they have dyslexia, because, for instance, they go to school and they're getting a lot of phonological awareness training, but that's not necessarily translating into improvements in reading. They're just getting better on the overt part of that, even though the underlying system where their phonological processing is still impaired is not changed at all. So if I can summarize that quickly then, because I am out of time, that ERPs reveal these interesting phonological differences between in how phonological competition works in kids with dyslexia versus control kids. And again, these are spoken tasks, right? These are spoken stimuli. And so sure, it's interesting that they show differences in reading, but I think it's equally important to illustrate how these are actually secondary to a more fundamental difference in how they organize the spoken code of their language. So there's a reduced influence of phonological similarity. We've shown this in a variety of ways in our lab. This is just one study. We've also shown it in other languages, like I said. We've also shown it using eye tracking, such that kids aren't activating rhyme competitors as strongly. The other thing is that these behavioral differences don't seem to echo that it's actually difficult at this age to see those behavioral differences. Okay, so let me summarize then. Finally, the alphabet is paying off for all of us, and that we know that reading builds on phonology and whole word processes. And I think it's super important to emphasize here that it builds on both. That doesn't mean that we should be teaching reading solely in one way or the other, but the other thing is that the way that we teach reading doesn't necessarily have to emphasize both of these processes. These whole word processes turn out to be quite easy to acquire once you've got the phonological processes in place. And so I've got a whole other talk that I could have given today that emphasizes the idea that the order in which kids learn this actually really matters as well. And I can point people in the right direction for that as well. It tends to be graded in interactive processes, that both of these kinds of knowledge are online at all times, right? So we always assume that as we become more experienced readers, we stop using phonological decoding processes. You want to make a joke about somebody being kind of dumb, you talk about how their lips move when they read, right? This is this idea that they've never really learned whole words or something. It turns out that I can show you using things like eye tracking and ERP that people are using phonology constantly while they read. They might swear up and down that they see the word cat and they're not thinking about the sound of cat, they just know that's cat. And I can make liars out of them, okay? That phonological processes are used near universally. But the balance with which we use those phonological processes versus these more orthographic whole word processes does differ from one subject to another. And you can actually show how that varies in terms of the neural representations as well. The other thing is that dyslexia represents an extreme case where kids are not using those phonological processes as much because the phonological system starts off behind in that race. And as a result, they have these specific problems with decoding that leads to the kinds of problems with reading that we see in dyslexia, which is decoding but also reading any word, because any word could be decoded, and initially you need to decode that word to learn it in the first place, so they're not picking it up. But also that there's interesting, subtle spoken language differences in these kids, right? It's not deafness, it's not problems with articulation, it's problems probably with accessing what those individual phonemes sound like and how they map onto the bigger picture of, for instance, articulations and sounds and so on. Okay, so I'm out of time. Let me thank my collaborators. Suzanne, welcome for part one. Emily Nichols and Randy Lynn Newman for part two of this. My lovely lab, I should say. You can find us on the web at these various websites and the nice people who fund this research. And also thanks for Joe for inviting me here. So thanks very much.
We have time for some questions from the audience. Start right there. Rhea?
Yeah, so I was curious a little bit about if there was any research on this from different types of languages, such as tonal languages or just non-English languages, and if there's similar results or if it's different.
So there's a very interesting debate in the neuroimaging literature of reading right now that looks at differences between Chinese and English or other alphabetic systems. One of the things that we think about when we see, for instance, Chinese languages is that Chinese languages use individual symbols to denote individual morphemes so that those symbols are not necessarily decomposable into individual sounds, right? On one view, that means that people who are reading Chinese don't engage this phonological system at all, and that these phonological effects that we see in reading, for instance, English and French and Italian, shouldn't happen in Chinese. balance of the information that we have is in fact that the opposite is true, that there are subtle phonological cues even in languages that are logographic like Chinese languages, that there are small cues about the sounds of the words in about 25 to 30% of the cases, that kids pick up on these very rapidly, that current instruction in China doesn't emphasize those phonological cues, but that if you teach kids who are learning Chinese to focus more on the sounds of words rather than the traditional way, which is just to learn how to make the different strokes and repeat them over and over again, that those kids who are more phonologically emphasized are actually going to pick up reading more rapidly and do better over time. And so that turns out to be a very difficult debate in China, where a lot of the educational policy is centralized and it's kind of like turning around a battleship sometimes. But for instance, people like Xu Hua at Beijing Normal University have done some very nice work illustrating how phonology matters, even in languages where you can imagine why phonology matters. There is probably going to be some differences, right? It's, again, a balancing act. It's trading relationships between a decoding-based versus a whole language-based approach. But the idea that you can lump languages into one bin or the other that either uses only phonology, like, say, Italian or Finnish, or only whole word reading, like Chinese, probably doesn't work. That, in fact, is going to be a continuum, and that in all cases, the networks tend to look alike. Yeah? Say that again, because I'm not sure I got it.
So when you're, let's say, when you're learning a different language,
Yeah.
and the findings that you had in the reading abilities that they have in their own language, is it going to be the same? Will they process these words in the same way that they would in their own native language?
Oh, so for people that learn two languages, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So learning, let's say, if you're grade 3 and learning a word that's university level, or you're grade 3 and learning a language from, learning a word from a different language, will those be two different processes, do you think?
That's hard to answer. I'm not sure I know the answer. I think my impression is that there's a certain process of scaffolding that happens where early learning to read is phonologically based and is heavily decoding based, but that in fact, if you look at the kinds of vocabularies that kids get early on versus later on, that yeah, there are probably differences in the characteristics of those words. The words tend to be longer and more multimorphemic, and that may matter a lot. And that also that a lot of English words are morphologically complex, and that the idea of morphological awareness becomes more and more important as kids get older as well. So knowing that ing has a certain meaning modulation, that running is the act of run plus ing, and that morphological awareness turns out to potentiate later language learning. So I could imagine that the processes do change over time, but I don't think in a qualitative way. I think they're always building and extrapolating on what's there already. That's tougher, especially if the orthographic script changes. If you go from reading, say, Roman orthography for English to an orthographic script like, say, a Chinese language, that may be quite different. But it's hard to tell right now. And I think one thing that I'm very curious about is the idea that which script you learned early on may set up your brain to look slightly different based on whether it's Chinese or English. And that's certainly the claim when you run a group of people who are reading Chinese versus a group of people who are reading English and compare that and see little differences in what parts of the brain light up. These are tiny differences, but they're there. Is it because their brain's wired up differently early on, right? Is it that those white matter pathways look different early on? Certainly some studies have made that claim. The problem is it's very difficult to come up with really pure groups of readers where, for instance, they've only learned one orthographic system or another, or where they're behaviorally identical in the two groups and the only difference that they've ever had in their lives is which script they learned, whereas in fact a whole go along with, for instance, learning a Roman orthography versus a logographic orthography. So it's hard to come up with the right study that's going to answer that definitively, but we're trying. Yeah?
So in something like sign language,
Yeah.
Is there a correlate to something that to people learning that would build whole signs on? I'm just curious.
Certainly signed languages have phonology in the sense that you can modulate the shape or the body position or the gesture that's being made, right? So apple is here versus, I can't remember, it says summer. So it's the same gesture and it's the same movement, but it's a different part of the body that's being signed at. So that's like phonology in a lot of ways because you're modulating the shape of it in a way that changes the meaning completely, and you can't predict the meaning from what you're seeing. How that maps onto reading is super hard, right? And it turns out there's no written form, for instance, of American Sign Language. And American Sign Language is both phonologically and grammatically completely different. Right, it bears no resemblance. And so kids who are American Sign Language signers find it very difficult to learn how to read. And typically when they graduate from high school, they're only reading typically at a 6th grade level. That would be kind of the level at which you're asking for. And that seems to be because they have to learn not just whole words, but entire texts sometimes as underanalyzed chunks, right? The analytic strategy does not work as easily for them. The last thing I'll say, though, is that the more experienced these individuals are at reading English, the more you see evidence that their brain is actually learning something about phonology. They're suddenly showing rhyming effects, even for words that don't have the same spelling. And this is a little bit mysterious because these individuals shouldn't be able to hear that, for instance, what's a good example here? Soap and rope. So soap, OAP, versus rope, OPE, they rhyme, but they're not orthographically the same. And yet you can show rhyming effects in those deaf readers, especially the very skilled ones. So something about their brain is starting to rewire itself to become aware of these rhyming relationships, even though they don't have the auditory code that they need. It's actually a very rich literature, so I'm only kind of skimming the top of it. Yeah?
I'm curious about the effects of intervention strategies.
Yeah.
So we have the dyslexic and their reading strategies to improve their
Yeah.
performance. Is there any evidence to show that fMRI, ERP data changes in a way that's closer to normal?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that people have done the studies. No, in the sense that the really good random controlled trial still hasn't happened. And I apologize to anybody in the room who thinks that's the opposite is true. I mean, there's lots of excellent work that's been done looking at kids who've either gotten the intervention versus controls, and showed a change in kids who've gotten an intervention, where the kids who've gotten an intervention started off dyslexic, got an intervention, their reading scores improved, and their brain images started to look more like that of controls. But there's a whole variety of things wrong with that. That's not an RCT, right? They haven't divided the group in two. They haven't, given some of them a sham intervention. The better interventions have been behavioral interventions, and it's work by people like Joe Torgerson, where this was done in the late 80s, early 90s, where they gave them large groups of kids, so 50 to 100 kids, and then in 3 or 4 different groups, some of them got a more phonics-based intervention, some of them got a whole language intervention, some of them got no intervention. And really the phonics-based intervention, the one that emphasizes phonological awareness and also mapping those sounds onto letters, seems to be the one that gives the biggest boost in reading improvement early on in early poor readers. And that seems to be the answer, that when you think about something that's broken, you can either work around it by being more whole languagey about it, and that's one approach, or you can try to emphasize what's broken and try to fix it. And it does seem like fixing it works better than trying to work around it. That's the short answer, that a phonological-based approach, even in kids who have very poor phonology, especially in kids with poor phonology, tends to be the approach that actually gives better outcomes in most kids. Yeah.
Looking at your ERPs for dyslexics, and you were focusing on the N400 difference,
Mm-hmm.
but it looked like earlier on, like N100, there were differences as well.
Yeah.
Are they related, or
Right, so if you look at that ERP time course, the devil of ERP is that you get more than one little thing to look at, and there are all kinds of things that could be different. The N100 looks at sensory processes. In that particular study, there were numerical differences in the N100s for the different conditions and also between groups, but that the differences didn't come out as significant. That we did see different waveform morphologies in some cases where you might think, well, what's going on there? But any kind of statistical look at it showed that they weren't different. What was interesting is that in a different group of kids that our lab also studies who have oral language impairments, there we did see early N100 differences, and that's across a couple of different studies now, which suggests that the more fundamental auditory processing impairment that would be indexed by an early, say, N100 P2 kind of difference, that would be more kids with oral language problems rather than kids who have dyslexia. Yeah. 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 Right. Okay, so the first question was why N400 when there's a whole bunch of different components. We did look at an earlier component, the N280/phonological mismatch negativity, and found that those differences seem to be less prevalent, right? So it didn't seem to be the actual recognition of the individual phoneme as much as it was integrating those phonemes into a greater whole. And it's probably because the stimuli we were using were natural speech that were very easy to recognize, and there was no reason to think they would have difficulty recognizing those individual phonemes in the stream. It really had to do with word-level processes. When you have word-level processes about how you recognize a word in isolation, that seems to be the sine qua non of N400 effects. P600 effects tend to come online when words are presented in sentences. We might get that in a spoken sentence with kids with dyslexia. We haven't looked, other labs have. So it may be that in a sentence context we might choose a P600 approach. Here the N400 was the earliest point at which we saw differences between the two groups and chose that as the place where we'd focus our analyses. You're right that there may be differences in these waveforms that get blurred out because they have to do with phase differences in these waveforms, where if you average waveforms of many different phases, you get a flat line, you wouldn't see a difference. And that power-based analyses might be something to do. I actually have a summer student this summer who's gone back to these data and is looking at power differences between the two groups. We haven't done the stats, that's what I'm doing next week. So I'd love to talk to you more about it actually, because I'd like to see what other labs are doing on this. But yeah, there's this idea that it may also be that different frequency bands like theta and alpha, for instance, may be also indicating word-level processing that can't be seen at the individual waveform basis. And we've done that in adults who are typical readers to contrast, you know, abstract versus non-abstract words, but we've not done it in dyslexia in this case. So this is our first stab at it.
Mark, I just want to ask one sort of peripheral question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the new DSM, there's been a recategorization of dyslexia. How does that impact, you know, researchers and even just perception of dyslexia?
I think that dyslexia has been left not untouched, but less harmed than oral language problems, things like specific language impairment, and that's where I think the greater damage has been done. That things like specific language impairment have been left out of the new DSM and been replaced by like a pragmatic language impairment, which is also a language impairment, but which is completely separate from the SLI/developmental dysphagia literature, where there's an entire literature on these children who probably are heterogeneous and difficult to actually identify as having a single behavioral marker that identifies them, but it's still an important group of kids who are in the schools, right? When we want to find these kids, we go to the schools and just screen hundreds of kids, and we find them. They're like 5 to 15% of classrooms, so they're out there. But yeah, that's been left out of DSM, and the question now is, well, what do you do about that? And I guess the issue is, maybe we don't care, right? Maybe DSM can do what it wants to do, and that ultimately, you know, maybe psychiatrists are not sensitive to it, but that, you know, speech-language pathologists are still in this bind where they need to understand how to categorize different groupings of kids with different kinds of impairments. And there's various efforts, I think in particular in England rather than here in North America, where they're really focusing on either getting it back in there or getting it better understood at the clinical and at the school level so that those literatures line up with the research, which is ongoing. I mean, people still do lots of language impairment research. My lab in particular focuses a lot on that and the difference between that and dyslexia.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to now take a break. We're going to reconvene at 12 o'clock. Kathy Georgiadis will give a talk on the impact of the structure of school programs on mental health. If you have a poster, please do put up your poster. Right now, coffee and refreshments are available. And see everyone back at 12 p.m. Thank you.